This week, our focus will be on connectivity. In this video, we will overview what we mean by connectivity, its different components, and some key related terms. Landscapes across the planet are not in uniform condition. For example, about 17% of land has been heavily modified, turned into cities and intensive agriculture. And about 56% is characterized by less intense modifications, such as rural and suburban development. This leaves about a quarter of Earth's terrestrial surface as relatively intact. Different conservation strategies are needed for each of these types of landscapes, but in all cases, there is a need for ecological connectivity within and across them. When we talk about ecological connectivity, what we mean is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth across landscapes and seascapes. Without connectivity, ecosystems cannot function properly, and without well-functioning ecosystems, biodiversity and the other fundamentals of life are at risk. Ecological connectivity is often measured through some metric of landscape connectivity, which is the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement among resource patches. Basically, when we measure and map connectivity, we are looking at how contiguous or how broken up or fragmented natural habitats are. Looking at these three photos, we can see different degrees of forest connectivity. On the left, we see a forest patch of high connectivity. The forest is contiguous and not broken up by anything. In the center, there is a row lower in connectivity because it has broken the forest into two patches. But those two patches themselves are still pretty connected. On the right, we see a more fragmented landscape. The forest has been broken into many different patches separated from one another by the farmland in between them. So why does connectivity matter? Why does it need to be maintained or restored? First of all, in general, a more connected landscape is a sign of healthier ecosystems, as a more connected landscape is one where species and natural processes are able to move and function unimpeded. One of the key goals of conservation is to protect intact ecosystems, as they provide the best chance to conserve biodiversity. This has led to protected areas becoming the foundation of nature conservation over the last century. But while protected areas are essential, they are no longer considered to be sufficient. Protected areas may not be well placed, they may be inadequately managed, or they may simply be too small and too isolated from other tracts of natural ecosystems to support biodiversity over the long term. Think back to our video on island biogeography from week 1. We know that the smaller and more isolated a patch is, the more vulnerable it is to extinctions and the less likely it is to be repopulated. A well-connected landscape allows for the metapopulation dynamics that we looked at last week to function properly. Without connectivity, the spatially distinct subpopulations of a metapopulation will end up staying isolated from one another, which decreases genetic diversity and the chances of re-establishing formerly extirpated subpopulations, which increases the chances of genetic bottlenecking and extinctions. We now know that the landscapes between protected areas matters, and that in addition to protected areas, measures must be taken to maintain, enhance, or restore connectivity within and between protected areas. By mapping connectivity, we can start to paint a picture of where wildlife might be moving and where they face significant barriers on the landscape. We can start to understand the effects that different management decisions like twinning a highway might have on wildlife movement. We also know that climate change is having and will continue to have profound effects on biodiversity, especially as landscapes change and habitats and climatic conditions shift their geographic distributions, forcing species to move with them. Maintaining or restoring the connectivity of natural ecosystems across large landscapes will help to provide for the best opportunities for species to naturally adapt and shift their ranges as climate change progresses. Without connectivity across large landscapes, species have limited opportunities to migrate to more favorable conditions as climate changes, making them more vulnerable to extinction. There are two types of connectivity, structural and functional. While they each inform and are related to each other, there are also distinct concepts that need to be distinguished. Structural connectivity is a measure of habitat permeability based on the physical features of the landscape and the physical arrangement of different landscape features. When we are looking at structural connectivity, we are looking at the size, shape, and spatial arrangement of different patches and how they come together to form the broader landscape. Structural connectivity is therefore a measure of how physically connected different habitat types are and is usually measured through the use of aerial photos or satellite images of the Earth's surface. On the other hand, functional connectivity is the degree to which evidence indicates that a landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of organisms. Functional connectivity is actual connectivity from a species perspective. But it should be noted that just because a landscape provides functional connectivity for one species, it doesn't mean that it facilitates connectivity for all species. In fact, what may be conducive to the movement of one species may actually be a barrier for another. For example, think about a cliff. While it may be perfectly manageable for a lizard or a mountain goat to scale the rock face, it's impossible to a lot of other species like moose. Functional connectivity is a lot harder to measure and map than structural connectivity, because not only is it a species-specific metric, it is also influenced by other factors such as a particular individual's abilities and motivations to move, and the level of risk encountered when traveling at a given time. Studies that measure functional connectivity usually involve things like behavioral experiments like translocation studies, resource selection models, or tagging and tracking experiments. It is important to note that while linked, structural and functional connectivity are independent concepts, and there may be instances where a landscape is structurally connected but not functionally, or functional connectivity may exist without structural connectivity. For example, there may be a corridor visible in the satellite imagery, but it may be too long or too narrow to support the movement of some species that favor more interior forest conditions, like the American marten. Similarly, habitat patches may be functionally connected without any visible landscape linkages, as is the case for many birds or habitat generalists like raccoons, which are able to move through and take advantage of the urban matrix. When we talk about connectivity, we will often talk about corridors. Corridors are linear patches that are different from their surroundings. In the context of conservation, corridors are linear patches of natural habitat that are surrounded by human-modified landscapes, like a corridor of forest surrounded by agricultural land or suburbs. Corridors are what provide space for biodiversity to move across the landscape in response to environmental changes, natural disasters, or as a part of their normal life cycles. Depending on the context, corridors may be part of a broader network, which we will get into more in the next slide, or they may be more of a one-off piece of green infrastructure, like a greenway or a greenbelt. When conservationists first started thinking about connectivity corridors, they were mostly focused on structural connectivity, and the goal was to physically connect protected areas through natural corridors. It has only been in the last 20 years or so that corridor design has taken a more functional approach, seeking to take species-specific needs into account in design. Designing corridors based on structural connectivity is now viewed as a coarse filter approach to conservation planning, a first step that accommodates the needs of many species, which is then augmented and supported by later design that considers the needs of more sensitive species and habitat specialists through more targeted and functional approaches. Corridors are most effective when they are part of an ecological network. An effective ecological network for conservation consists of two key parts: areas that expressly work towards the protection of biodiversity, things like protected areas, and the ecological corridors that connect them. Ecological networks are the backbone of connectivity conservation, and they're more effective in achieving biodiversity conservation objectives than a disconnected collection of protected areas because they enhance the integrity, viability, and stability of protected areas in fragmented systems and make them less vulnerable to threats, especially in the context of climate change. Ecological networks are particularly important for large, wide-ranging species like wolves and grizzly bears, as individual protected areas are often not big enough for them to maintain a minimum viable population. For these species, connectivity between larger habitat fragments is essential for their long-term survival. The opposite of a connected landscape is a fragmented one, and the reality is that most of the planet's landscapes are fragmented. They are broken up into small and isolated patches, which, as we know from our lessons on island biogeography, is a key driver of species extinctions and the global biodiversity crisis. The fragmentation of natural ecosystems is one of the greatest challenges that conservationists must face. Excluding Antarctica, over 75% of terrestrial ecosystems have been directly modified by human activities. And at the global scale, 70% of the world's remaining large tracts of intact natural landscapes are now just restricted to 5 countries, one of which is Canada. The others are Russia, Australia, the United States, and Brazil. The situation in the ocean is a bit harder to see visually, but it is estimated that nearly 90% of marine biomes are impacted by human activities. The goal with connectivity conservation is really about reducing fragmentation and reversing its effects through restoration efforts.